all for coming today. We have one of my favorite speakers here. Doug Simon has spoken here over 30 times. He came here starting on February 9th, 1989, on the topic Vietnam Retrospective. It was 20 years after Tet. I remember you telling me. Those things I remember. But in any case, you were so good and you were so kind that you came back at least once or twice a year afterwards. He taught in Drew. He's a lecturer, speaker, and he has been so kind to us throughout the years. And he spoke on the new faces of communism, globalization, and every year we usually call it World Political Update. And Doug informs us what's happening all over the world. But because Doug was coming, it's funny, we used to film these programs in the late 80s, and when I started in 1986, I would get a student from Columbia High School to film the programs. And so this is one from November 7th, 1996, Doug Simon, post-election analysis of the 1996 presidential race. Okay. I have wonderful ones, and we're going to change it so it'll be in our archives. And like I say, I haven't looked at these in over 20 years, but it'll be fascinating. And we haven't changed a bit, so. No. But in any case, I'm thrilled to have you here because there's so much that's happening in the news, and I really want your opinion on it. And so before I begin, I always thank all of my fellow friends and librarians for all of their help and support for these programs. I couldn't do it without them. And I certainly couldn't do it without a speaker who is so kind and generous, who donates his talent, bringing us all the latest information. Thank you. And you're wonderful, and I appreciate you very much, Doug. Thank you. And so please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very special guest, Doug Simon.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Microphone. I usually don't even need a mic, but we'll use one today. Good afternoon. It's nice to be here once again and share some thoughts with you about what is going on in the world. Today I'd like to offer some comments on what many people consider to be the three most serious problems facing the United States, certainly international or global problems, if you will. Those being the problem of terrorism, obviously, our deteriorating relationship with Russia, and climate change, which now has been elevated to a major national security threat by the National Security Council, as well as the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon. As always, I'd be happy to answer questions concerning other issues in the areas of foreign policy and world affairs in the question and answer period, so don't feel confined by these three topics I'm going to talk about today. As some of you may know from hearing me on previous occasions, I'm a great believer in putting things into historical perspective. And so it is with the issue of terrorism. My comments on this subject are not meant in any way to diminish those who have suffered from terrorism. The pain and sorrow of attacks like those in Madrid, London, Paris, and San Bernardino cannot and should not be trivialized. And like so many of us, I am particularly sensitive to the impact of 9/11 and the scale of that act of terror. And there is, to be sure, cause for concern. ISIS has been relentless in its radicalization recruitment efforts, using social media and dedicated websites to encourage Americans to take up arms and to join the cause, by, among other things, killing Americans on their own soil, and to particularly go after law enforcement officials. But I fear, particularly in the middle of a presidential campaign, that we are completely and totally obsessed with the threat of foreign terrorism in this country, and frankly, that the level of fear is exaggerated. Stoked by a rating-hungry media, politicians exploiting that fear, and sadly, a cottage industry reining in enormous economic gain as a result. The fear also generates far too many ill-advised policies that are potentially dangerous and conflict with traditional American values. Here I am obviously referring to the NSA's or National Security Agency's efforts to tap into American citizens' phones and computer communication systems. Now let me make myself perfectly clear. I'm not against all policies and expenditures to lower the probability of terrorist acts succeeding. I am not in favor of returning to the security conditions, or better put, the lack of security conditions prior to 9/11. But somehow we have to get a realistic handle on some of these expenditures and policies and put the threat to our physical and psychological well-being into perspective. As Peter Bergen, one of the foremost terror analysts, put it in his new book, The United States of Jihad, this is not World War II we are dealing with. Terrorists are not anywhere near capable of bringing down the United States. A level of disruption, some fear, some random deaths, yes. Destruction of the country, no. The first thing we might do is look at history. One common misconception, particularly among the younger generation, is that terrorism is a new and unprecedented phenomenon. In actuality, terrorism is not an invention of modern times. It is about as old as recorded history. It tends to be a weapon of the weak, not the strong. It is a weapon used because the forces behind it are not strong enough to directly confront those in power, whether they be domestic governments or foreign governments. The very words most closely associated with political terror have a long, long history. The word zealot comes from a group of first-century Jews who tried to overthrow Roman rule after biblical Palestine through the use of murder and assassination. The zealots later committed mass suicide at Masada. Our word assassin comes from a Shiite Muslim sect that sought to assassinate Sunni Muslim leaders from the 11th through the 13th centuries. Supposedly this group was named the Hashashin because it used hashish before committing acts of violence, thus giving rise to the word assassin. Hashashin, assassin. And finally, the word terrorism comes from the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, when terror was used as an instrument of the state policy following the revolution. Terror was used to eliminate counter-revolutionary elements in the population, save France from anarchy and military defeat, and suppress hoarding and profiteering. Another misconception is that terrorism is essentially a Middle Eastern or left-wing phenomenon. In fact, terrorism has and is being used by many groups in different parts of the world for diverse purposes. Modern terrorism arose in Tsarist Russia in the 1870s. The Black Hand movement operating in the Balkans during the same time period was a much feared terrorist organization. In more contemporary times, in Colombia, right-wing paramilitaries killed hundreds of villagers they accused of collaborating with Marxist guerrillas. In Ireland, the IRA has a long history of using terrorism against British occupiers. The struggle to achieve Israeli statehood in the years immediately after World War II was not without the use of terror by violent Zionists. The most famous incident was the blowing up of the King David Hotel. Terror was used for years in northern Spain by Basque groups seeking independence. The Kurdish Workers' Party, otherwise known as the PKK, regularly used terror in the 1970s against the Turkish government, and perhaps even today. The Sri Lankan Liberation Tigers of Tamil used suicide bombing and other lethal tactics to wage a battle for independence against the Sinhalese majority government. International terrorism became a prominent issue in the late 1960s when hijacking became a favored tactic. In 1968, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine hijacked an El Al flight. Dozens of passenger flights were thus and consequently skyjacked. 20 years later, after that first incident, the bombing of Pan Am flight over Lockerbie, Scotland, shocked the world. In 1972, we witnessed the bloody terrorist attack on the Munich Olympics perpetrated by the Palestinian group Black September. What about terrorism within the United States? Well, terrorism has been with us since the founding of the Republic. Although the Boston Tea Party does not necessarily come to mind as an act of terrorism, the staged rebellion by colonists was meant to threaten the British into changing its policy of taxing colonist tea imports, while offering a tariff-free trade to its East India Tea Company. Putting the Boston Tea Party in the category of terrorism can be a useful exercise for comparing the goals and tactics of different national liberation groups, which is what the American, once upon a time, were. The first and arguably most entrenched terrorist activity in the United States is based on white supremacy, which holds that the white Protestant Christians are superior to other ethnicities and races, and that public life should reflect the purported hierarchy. In the period before the Civil War, American social organizations did in fact reflect a presumed white supremacy since slavery was legal. It was only after the Civil War, when Congress and the Union military began to enforce equality between the races, that white supremacy really emerged. The Ku Klux Klan grew out of this period using a variety of means to terrorize and harm African Americans and sympathetic whites. In 1871, they were outlawed by Congress as a terrorist group, but they have had several violent incarnations since then. On May 4th, 1886, at Haymarket Square, a rally was organized by labor radicals to protest the killing and wounding of several workers by the Chicago police during a strike the day before at the McCormick Reaper Works. Toward the end of the Haymarket Square rally, a group of policemen arrived to disperse the crowd. As the police advanced, an individual who was never identified threw a bomb at them. The police and possibly members of that group opened fire, and chaos ensued. 7 police officers and at least 1 civilian died as a result of the violence that day, and an untold number of the people were injured. The riot set off a national wave of xenophobia as scores of labor organizers and foreign-born radicals were rounded up by the police in Chicago and elsewhere. In August 1886, 8 men labeled anarchists were convicted in a sensational and controversial trial in which the jury was considered to be biased, and no solid evidence was presented linking the defendants to the bombing. The Bolshevik Revolution that created the Soviet Union in 1917 had a powerful effect on socialist-minded revolutionaries the world over, including the United States. And the Roaring Twenties, a period of tremendous wealth building by American robber barons, provided a useful background for agitators against inequality. Most of this agitation had nothing to do with terrorism. Labor strikes were common, for example. But anarchist and communist violence expressed the extreme end of a mainstream rift running through American society. The resulting Red Scare expressed people's terrible fear that a communist revolution could unfold on American soil. One of the first cases of terrorism to be investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation was the 1920 bombing of Wall Street by suspected anarchists. A spate of unsolved bombings in 1920 also gave rise to the infamous Palmer raids, a series of mass arrests of Americans of Russian and other origin. The 1920s were also a period of upsurge of the KKK violence carried out not only against African Americans, but also against Jews, Catholics, and immigrants. In the 1970s, terrorism emerged big time, with groups such as the Weathermen and the Weather Underground turning violent in their protest of the Vietnam War. Indeed, the late 60s and throughout much of the 1970s saw an unprecedented wave of terrorist attacks, not merely in the United States, but around the world, far exceeding anything that we see today. But the greatest number of worldwide terrorist attacks, strangely enough, did not take place in the 1970s, or even today for that matter. It was the period between 1980 and 1990. And believe it or not, for the last 26 years, the frequency of these attacks has been dropping. Now, it is possible that the reduced number of attacks is due in part to the countermeasures taken by the United States and other countries in response to 9/11. But I think the thing worth noting here is that over the past roughly 60 years, the world has experienced periods of extraordinary terrorism. This is not a new phenomenon that somehow started with 9/11. Depending on how you define the act of terrorism within the United States, since 9/11, there have been roughly 40 to 45 significant terrorist acts involving the wounding or killing of people via firearms or explosives of one sort or another. 1/2 of these were jihadist related, and the other half were basically domestic in nature. White supremacists, right-wing anti-government types, anti-abortion, environmental extremism, and animal rights, and a couple were specifically identified as being carried out by people who were mentally ill. Some of the better-known attacks include the 2002 Beltway sniper attacks in and around Washington, D.C., some of you may recall, the 2008 torching of 4 luxury homes in Woodinville, Washington by the Earth Liberation Front, the 2009 assassination of George Tiller by Scott Roker in Wichita, Kansas. Roker was an anti-abortion extremist. Also in 2009, Abdul Mohammed shot and killed a military recruiter and wounded another in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 2013, you will recall, the Boston Marathon bombing took place, perpetrated by the Zarnarev brothers. In 2015, the Charleston church shooting in Emmanuel African AME Church by a 21-year-old white supremacist, Dylan Reed, took place. That same year, we witnessed the San Bernardino shooting that left 13 dead and 17 injured. In addition to the successful attacks over this same time period, we have recorded at least 10 failed attacks, 5 being jihadist and 5 carried out for other motives. So roughly half of all the major terrorist attacks occurring in this country over the past 15 to 16 years are either carried out by foreign jihadists or by Americans inspired by movements like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The other half are committed by American citizens with motives totally unrelated to jihad and Islam. Overall, the probability of an American being victim of a terrorist attack in this country on any given day, regardless of motive, is roughly 1 in 4 million. And that drops to 1 in 8 million, specifically by terrorists motivated by jihad. So I think it is important to put the threat in perspective, both in terms of who is doing it and its frequency. Has the war on terror been a success or a failure? Well, quite frankly, there are really 2 ways to argue this. The first is that overall it has been a success if one measures success by how safe the United States is from foreign terror attack. The work of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, counterterrorism fusion centers, the NSA and state departments and local law enforcement has, by and large, held foreign terror attacks to a minimum since 9/11. As we have already noted, this does not mean that counterterrorism efforts for the homeland are foolproof. They are not, as evidenced by the jihadist attacks carried out since 9/11. But as serious as they were, that still means jihadist attacks have come at a rate slightly over 1 per year since 9/11. But there's another way of looking at this from a more global perspective. If one posits that the U.S., while not alone in the war against terror, is certainly leading it and devoting more resources to it than any other country in the world, then its efforts can hardly be called a success. The failure argument is built on 2 realities. First, the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 was an unmitigated disaster. The U.S. badly miscalculated how they would be received following the fall of Saddam Hussein. After the invasion, the decision to oust most of the Sunni-based military personnel forced them underground and conducted a vicious 4-year campaign against U.S. forces in the country, with its principal weapon being the IED, or the improvised explosive device, most often a roadside bomb. The chaos of that period led to the formation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu al-Sakarawi. a particularly brutal terrorist made famous by decapitating his captives. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was the forerunner of ISIS. The second measure of failure of the war on terror became apparent with the first moves from Washington after 9/11. The war would be waged without any confrontation with Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, two close U.S. allies, despite the fact that without the involvement of these two countries, 9/11 was unlikely to have happened. Of the 19 hijackers that day, 15 were Saudi. Bin Laden came from the Saudi elite. And subsequent U.S. official documents stressed repeatedly that financing for al-Qaeda and jihadi groups came from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies. The importance of Saudi Arabia is based on more than its oil and vast wealth. Another factor is its propagating of Wahhabism, the fundamentalist 18th century version of Islam that imposes Sharia law, relegates women to the status of second-class citizens, and regards Shia and Sufi Muslims as non-Muslims to be persecuted, along with Christians and Jews. The ideology of al-Qaeda and ISIS draws a great deal from Wahhabism. In one country after another, Saudi Arabia is putting up the money for the training of preachers and the building of mosques. The result of this is the spread of sectarian strife between Sunni and Shia. As for Pakistan, its army and military service played a central role since the early 1990s in propelling the Taliban into power in Afghanistan, where they hosted bin Laden and al-Qaeda. After a brief hiatus during and after 9/11, Pakistan resumed its support for the Afghan Taliban. There is, of course, a third reason often sounded for the failure of the war on terror, and that is the use of drones to kill the leadership of terrorist groups most frequently used now against ISIS. This reason is not entirely clear. The claim is made that by using this type of attack, while less devastating in general in the killing of innocent civilians, drone attacks have, in fact, killed a number of civilians, and this has contributed to the radicalization and recruitment efforts by ISIS. In general, I subscribe to this assertion, but the problem comes in determining just how much it contributes to successful recruitment. That it has played a role, there is no doubt. The problem is determining how much. Well, let's shift gears now. When I look out at our relations with Russia today, things, at least for me, several things come to mind. The first is the country's dogged and, I think, tragic march towards authoritarianism. And second is the increasing tensions with the West, particularly NATO. There is no denying that Russia under President Vladimir Putin is increasingly dictatorial. And to a great degree, I think this is a reflection both of his personality and belief system. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there are two fascinating stories you may have already heard. Indeed, I may have even told them here in the past. Regardless, they are instructive and worth repeating. The first involved a visit by Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots football team, to St. Petersburg. There, Kraft met Putin at a gathering of business leaders. Putin asked Kraft to show him his Super Bowl ring, which was worth some $25,000. He then tried it on and said, I could kill someone with this. Then, according to Kraft himself, Putin put it in his pocket, drew his security guards around him, and left the room.
That's right.
The second incident occurred 3 months later when Putin was visiting the Guggenheim Museum in New York. He was shown a glass replica of a Kalashnikov gun filled with vodka. Putin nodded to one of his guards, who, to the astonishment of all present, simply pocketed the piece. Now, what do these two incidents and several similar ones tell us? Well, first, Putin does not seem to be bound by ordinary rules of civility. Second, he has a high degree of contempt, particularly of the West, and a feeling that he can do just about anything he feels like. He himself came from poverty in a Leningrad haunted by memories of starvation and death. So in addition to arrogance and contempt, we find a degree of fear, the fear of losing power, something that torments all autocrats. Now, if we combine these personality traits with the elements of this broader worldview, the moves in places like Ukraine make more sense. Listen to his words. Quote, above all, we should acknowledge that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geopolitical disaster of the country. Tens of millions of our co-citizens and compatriots found themselves outside of Russian territory. End of quote. Put simply, what happened at the end of the Cold War, the implosion of the Soviet Empire, was a catastrophe. And he feels that he must do whatever is necessary to reconstitute as much of the empire, or at least its sphere of influence, as possible. The first step is control of the Russian state itself. In mid-2004, Putin announced plans for sweeping changes in Russia's governance system, namely an extraordinary centralization of power in the Kremlin. The alleged reason for this action centered on the Chechen terrorist problem. Indeed, in September of 2004, Chechen terrorists entered the Beslan school in North Ossetia and held 1,100 hostages for 3 days, including 777 children. Russian security forces eventually stormed the building, ending the crisis, but not before some 385 hostages were killed, including 186 children. But there were earlier signs of a power grab, and for different reasons. Just a few months earlier, President Putin opened up a war against the so-called oligarchs of the new Russia. These were businessmen who quickly took advantage of the privatization of a good share of Russia's large business enterprises after the fall of communism in 1990. Some were engaged in questionable business practices. Others were totally legitimate. Regardless, Putin went after them, and over the past few years, the arrest of rich businessmen, stripping them of their assets by the state, has become almost routine. Putin then began to move on the Russian media that had a period of unprecedented freedom in the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2013, he dissolved the main state news agency, RIA Novosti, and created a new state-run agency to exclusively promote Moscow's image abroad. In other words, a propaganda arm of the Kremlin. Most disturbing are a series of assassinations of prominent oligarchs and dissidents that go all the way back to 1998. Finally, we know that Putin himself has ordered all kinds of pressures against some of the former republics of the Soviet Union that are now independent countries. Sometimes the pressure to align closer with Moscow came with the threat of withholding trade or valuable natural gas, and sometimes with force. And it was consistent with the latter that in 2014, Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula, part of Ukraine. The Ukraine operation, which is still going on, had several motives. I'm not sure I feel comfortable ranking them, but in my judgment, they all played a role. First, it is true that there are thousands of Russian citizens trapped, if you will, in the former republics and feeling discriminated against. But remember how they got there. To a large degree, the Russian diaspora to those republics during the rise of the Soviet Union under Stalin was for the purpose of strengthening ties to the Kremlin, to secure greater Russian influence within the republics themselves. In other words, one could say these Russian nationals were used during the building of the Soviet Union, and their descendants are being used now to rationalize the seizure of territory. The second factor in his decision to go into Ukraine had to do with its strategic location, and most specifically the Crimean Peninsula and its port of Sevastopol. Its historical links go back to Catherine the Great in the 18th century, when Russia conquered southern Ukraine and Crimea, taking it from the Ottoman Empire. Now, in 1954, then head of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, handed Crimea to Ukraine as a gift, a move that absolutely mystified and outraged many Russians. This appeared to have been a personal decision on Khrushchev's part. There is no known record of a debate or a vote within the inner sanctum of the Kremlin, either the Central Committee of the Communist Party or the Politburo. For Putin, the retaking of the peninsula is merely putting Crimea back where it belonged. The third rationale for Putin's move has to do with Ukraine flirting with the idea of membership in NATO and the European Union, and the broader issue of perceived threat to Russia's sphere of influence after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990. In the wake of the implosion of the Soviet Empire, several things transpired. First, Western social scientists, political scientists like me, descended on Russia with the intention of showing Russia how to establish a viable democracy. Put simply, this greatly offended the Russians. It was like rubbing failure in their faces. Second, both NATO and the European Union moved quickly, not only into the Eastern European states like Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland, but also the former republics of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, putting in motion plans for membership in these two organizations. And finally, the United States negotiated the deployment of anti-missile systems in the Czech Republic and Poland. And now, over the last 2 weeks, we learn the U.S. has announced the deployment of F-16 fighters to Finland, and we are putting tanks and troops into Norway, into the vast secure tunnel system that was originally established under NATO years and years ago. Now, all of these moves were perceived by Moscow as threatening and most dangerous at a time when Russia was weak, immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Given the history of the invasions of Mother Russia, most notably Napoleon's invasion in 1812 and Hitler's Operation Barbarossa in 1940, the Kremlin is absolutely paranoid about threats to their borders. So when Ukraine began toying with the idea of a move toward the West with the EU and with NATO, Putin felt compelled to act. Now, does all of this warrant the seizure of Crimea and the threat to eastern Ukraine? No, it does not. Nevertheless, it goes a long way in explaining why Putin did what he did, and apparently is still doing in asserting Russian influence in eastern Ukraine. In sum, I believe the U.S.-Russian relationship, which has recently become more tense, needs to be analyzed and understood not only in terms of the two actors themselves, but also the dynamic between the two and how each perceives the other. Are we headed for a new Cold War? Frankly, I do not know. Let me shift gears to our final topic, another issue facing the U.S. and the world, that of climate change. The modern environmental movement was born in the 1960s with the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb in 1968. Carson's book warned us of the dangers of pesticides, and Ehrlich predicted widespread starvation around the globe caused by enormous population pressures. In 1972, the first global environmental conference was held in Stockholm, and consistent with Ehrlich's predictions of doom, issued almost Armageddon-type predictions about global environment. The problem was that during those early years, many of the environmentalists fell victim to exaggeration, basically overstating for effect, particularly on the issue of population growth. For example, as early as 1948 in his book Road to Survival, William Vogt, a former Audubon Society official who later became the National Director of Planned Parenthood, declared the United States already overpopulated at 147 million. The day of judgment is at hand, he said. 1968, Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb and declared that the battle to feed humanity had been lost and that there would be a major food shortage in the United States. He wrote that, quote, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions are going to starve to death. And by the 1980s, most of the world's important resources would be depleted. He forecast that 63 million Americans would die of starvation between 1980 and 1989. And that by 1999, the population would decline to 22.5 million people. Even with these catastrophic predictions, the problem in the United States, he asserted, would be relatively minor compared to those of the rest of the world. The Limits to Growth study, published in 1972, projected the world would run out of gold by 1981, mercury and silver by 1985, tin by 1987, zinc by 1990, petroleum by 1992, and copper, lead, and natural gas by 1993. It also stated that the world had only 33 to 49 years of aluminum resources left, which means we could run out sometime between 2005 and 2021. Now, it's not as though the United States and the world had no environmental problems. They did. Pollution was a horrid problem in many of the world's urban centers, lakes, and rivers. The use and overuse of pesticides was a serious concern. And while population in absolute terms did not have the impact that many of the early projections asserted, the problem of rapid urbanization was beginning to have an enormous detrimental impact around the world. Now, it is true that there are powerful economic forces attempting to undermine the credibility of the climate change movement. A lot of this effort being funded by key actors in the petroleum and coal industries. But I think it is also fair to say that the nature of many of the early environmental predictions that did not come to pass damaged the credibility of the environmental movement in general. Further, it made it just that much more difficult to convince a large percentage of humanity that we are facing a genuine global threat with climate change, much less a threat to our national security. Regardless, I do not believe we should be deterred by the exaggerated predictions made some 40 or 50 years ago about the environment. In my judgment, the overwhelming preponderance of the world's scientific community has spoken empirically, loud and clear, about what we are going to experience if climate change continues on its present course. The world scientists, and most particularly professional climatologists, agree on a few basic facts. First, the world's surface temperature has been rising at an alarming rate since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around 1880, when global temperatures were first taken in a systematic way. Averaged over all land and ocean surfaces, temperatures warmed roughly 1.53 degrees Fahrenheit from 1980 to 2014. And 2015 was the hottest year on record for the Earth. Now, this seems like a pretty small increase, 1.53 degrees, but two things to note. First, it only takes very slight fluctuations in the Earth's surface temperatures to have a meaningful impact on climate. And second, what is disturbing is the speed with which this increase in temperature has occurred. Now, some people argue, particularly the climate change deniers, that what we are experiencing now is only part of a natural cycle, that the Earth has numerous times experienced increases and decreases in temperature. True. But those shifts took hundreds and hundreds of years to take place, in some cases thousands of years. By comparison, the current increase in temperature is occurring in a nanosecond of global history and cannot be explained by natural weather cycles. The most powerful factor in all of this is the surface temperature over the world's oceans. Because the oceans continuously interact with the atmosphere, sea surface temperature can have a profound effect on global climate. Increases in sea surface temperature have led to an increase in the amount of atmospheric water vapor over the oceans. This water vapor feeds weather systems that produce precipitation, increasing the risk of heavy rain and snow, and can lead to increased intensity and frequency in tropical cyclone activity, and shift storm tracks, contributing to prolonged droughts in some regions. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the second conclusion that the preponderance of the scientific community has come to is that this global warming is caused by the greenhouse effect, whereby the entire heat, the Earth's heat is trapped by the atmosphere by such heat-absorbing gases as carbon dioxide, chlorofluorocarbons, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. Coal burning, vehicle emissions, and large-scale clearing of tropical forests each add to the increase of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. Concentration of carbon dioxide, the major cause of global warming, increased at their fastest rate for 30 years in 2015, despite warnings from the world scientists of the need to cut emissions to halt temperature rises. Finally, experts warn that the world's is running out of time to reverse rising levels of carbon dioxide to tackle climate change. If gone unchecked, the increases in the Earth's surface temperatures are and will continue to lead to a number of serious developments that we are all too familiar with. Increases in heavy downpours, rising temperature and sea level, rapidly retreating glaciers, thawing permafrost, lengthening growing seasons, lengthening ice-free seasons in the ocean and on lakes and rivers, earlier snowmelt, and alterations in river flows. Climate change will also stress fresh water resources. Crop and livestock production will be increasingly challenged. Coastal areas are at increasing risk from sea level rise and storm surge. Threats to human health will increase. Heat strokes, waterborne diseases, poor air quality, extreme weather events, and diseases transmitted by insects and rodents. Now, on December 12, 2015, only a couple of months ago, 198 countries met in Paris and agreed to what is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the first comprehensive global treaty to combat climate change. Because it is a treaty, it will require the approval or ratification by the signatories to go into effect. Specifically, 55 countries must ratify it, and those 55 must represent a minimum of 55% of the released greenhouse gases in the world. The target objective of the conference was to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. The agreement calls for 0 net greenhouse gas emissions to be reached during the second half of the 21st century, and will pursue efforts to limit the temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade, requiring 0 emissions sometime between 2030 and 2050. In addition to the use of existent and revolutionary technology to provide alternative sources of energy, another significant tool for keeping us within that 2 degree centigrade global warming target is a massive expansion of carbon trading between multinational corporations and countries. The Paris Agreement is both good and bad. The good, obviously, is that this is a major reversal from the disastrous Copenhagen meeting in 2009, which was a miserable failure. The Paris meeting had the preponderance of the world's nations seriously discussing global warming and the dire consequences of doing nothing. It further resulted in an agreement that established some pretty significant goals for protecting the Earth's atmosphere. But there is a high degree of uncertainty surrounding the agreement, primarily because it relies on, quote, voluntary, national determined contributions by governments. Further, as I just noted, there's a heavy reliance on carbon emission trading between countries and companies. You might recall that carbon trading is the exchange of credits between nations designed to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide. The carbon trade allows countries that have higher carbon emissions to purchase the right to release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from countries that have lower carbon emissions. The problem here is that there is a considerable amount of evidence that the limited carbon trading markets that we have in place have not worked very well thus far. Whether the new agreement marks a real turning point in our ability and will to thwart global warming and climate change remains an open question. Well, this afternoon I focused on 3 problems that deserve our attention. In one case, that of terrorism, I believe there is a tendency to exaggerate the fear and perhaps give it too much attention. In the case of U.S.-Russian relations, we must begin to pay more attention. And in the third case, climate change, we certainly have yet to pay it the degree of attention that it deserves. On that, I will close and be happy to tackle questions. You notice me squinting up here. I've got new glasses. I'm still getting adjusted to them.
And it matches your tone.
Wow, you tackled everything.
Yes, ma'am.
First of all, I disagree with you on the security issue.
Okay.
New York is a very vulnerable target. Now, Obama's administration just yesterday admitted to cutting $180 million to $90 million to get back at Chuck Schumer because he didn't vote with Obama for the Iran deal. That's disgusting, that's terrible, and Obama's done a lot of things that are bad.
Is this cutting the funding for anti-terrorism?
That's right, so that means all New York, with everything that they need, how can you cut 180 million? Obama came to New York 5 times last year with the security of New York protecting him, and then he lets this guy, I saw him on television this morning, well, we're getting back at Chuck, this is Obama spoken, we're getting back at Chuck Schumer because he voted against everything. How do you take something out on one person and hurt the entire fact?
Well,
He has to
said
be.
that.
You
Schumer
don't.
said I'm getting.
You
No,
know,
Obama's
that's
guy
not-
said that.
that's not-
It was on the, he
I
spoke, I
understand,
saw
I hear
him.
you, I hear you. It's not good politics, and it's not
I saw this guy talk.
it's not ethical. He also appropriated $14 billion for cybersecurity.
Cybersecurity is one thing, but there's
Cybersecurity
terrorist
is the
attacks.
absolute linchpin of anti-terrorism.
Okay, true, but what about Tim Cook from Apple not letting FBI
Oh,
get
I think Tim
in-
Cook's got a good case. I think ultimately, let me tell you this, ultimately he will lose. Tim Cook will lose.
I hope
But
so.
he has a case.
Why?
Once you design the software, to crack a phone, that's it. The genie is out of the bottle. Your phones are no longer secure. That is the problem.
Okay, Tim Cook said they can get through the back door. The FBI, head of the FBI said, we don't want to get back through the back door. There are 10,000 ways that you cannot get into these terrorist phones. He should give the FBI, he's talking about these terrorists, these two
I know what he's
terrorist
talking
people.
about.
He's wrong, and the judge said he has to do it, and he refuses to do it.
He refuses to do it, and I told you, he is going to lose the case. He will lose the case. Apple will
hope so.
lose the case. But he is making a stand because he is concerned about billions and billions of cell phones around the country. People who depend upon that password and security system so they will not be cracked. Look, it's the same argument with regard to the National Security Agency, putting pressure on Google, AT&T, and other communication networks to get into their system to listen to phone calls. And it's a battle. Look, it's a battle between the right to privacy, secure privacy in a democracy, which has been a linchpin of this country, and the issue of security. Okay? There is no good answer. There is no good answer. If you open the floodgates without ever considering the violation of privacy, then a major portion of democracy is gone. Your freedom is gone because the potential for misuse for other people, governments, corporations, criminals to get hold of that software and to begin to use it to exploit people and to exploit people of the United States is a real concern. Now, you have to balance that against what you're saying, which is the security argument. And I agree with that. But I am here to tell you, and I believe this firmly, there is no easy answer. It is not black and white. It is not black and white. I do not want software entering the system that can crack my phone. I really don't want that.
But we're only talking about these two terrorists. What has that got to do
No,
with
no, 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 no,
everybody?
no, no, no. In order to do that, you have to design a piece of software which can be universally used. That's the problem. Who controls the software? Where does it go after you've cracked that single phone?
But the terrorists are hacking, they're getting into
No.
all of this social
No.
media.
No, they're not. In fact, their ability in cyber communications and the ability to tap into phones and other communication networks is primitive at best. What they're very good at is the social media, which is an entirely different thing. Entirely different thing. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about what's happening with the Republicans and the Democrats. Would you mind giving me a little bit of your own? I can't watch the debates anymore. They're very,
I refuse to watch them.
that's exactly
I don't
how
watch
I
either
feel.
party
They're
anymore.
frustrated.
Yeah, well, look, what am I going to say? There's a lot of yelling going on. There's a lot of accusations and name-calling going on. There are a lot of proposals being made that don't stand a chance, number one, of getting through Congress, and second, are totally unfundable. I'm speaking primarily of Bernie Sanders right now. And Donald Trump his comments about foreign policy, and I would say even Ted Cruz to a certain extent, are ludicrous. They're absolutely ludicrous. I mean, you've got Republican statesmen who never ran for political office, don't owe anything to anybody, sitting back saying, this is not foreign policy, this is nonsense. And I'm concerned, to put it bluntly. I personally think, and I've said this to many people, and I've said it publicly, I think we have, among the industrialized democracies of the world, we have absolutely the worst leadership recruitment system that you could possibly devise. It's terrible. And it's a system which is haunted by two things right now. One is money, huge concentrations of money in both parties. And second, so accusatory, so investigative, that I think it is difficult to really recruit or get highly qualified people to run.
Right.
Why would anyone want to subject themselves to this? And I despair at that. I really do. And I think that it's not whether I'm Republican or Democrat, whether I'm on the left or the right, whether I'm liberal or conservative. It's we've got a broken system.
Yes.
It's a terrible system for recruiting presidents of the United States. And I don't, you know, it's very typical for Americans to solve problems after the crisis has occurred, after the catastrophes occur. And maybe that's what it'll take in this case. I don't know. But I think it's a very, very serious problem. I watched the first couple of debates on both sides, and I refuse to watch after that. I'll read the Times of the Wall Street Journal and their accounts of who won and who lost and what was said. But I won't watch it anymore. It's 3 hours wasted as far as I'm concerned.
Amen.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you feel about the Bloomberg entering into
I will tell you this.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, how do I feel about Bloomberg? I will be very honest with you. There were, and this is not an endorsement of Michael Bloomberg, but there were times in this mess through these debates and stuff, I shouted at the television, said, "Where's Michael Bloomberg when you need him?" You know, I mean, I think he was a very, very good mayor. I mean, he wasn't perfect, but he was basically a pretty sound mayor. He's a pretty reasonable guy. But there are two problems. One is the fate of third-party candidates,
Right.
in this case an independent. It doesn't work, and he will take votes away from somebody. The question is, who does he take the votes away from? The second problem is a Jewish New Yorker billionaire
Never.
who's liberal on the social issues and a
Never
fiscal
make it.
conservative. That ain't going to fly in the Bible Belt.
No.
It's just not. And but your question is a good question because it raises the whole question, and you kind of say to you, where are the statesmen? Where are these leaders from the past that seem to get somewhat above the fray of politics? I mean, you know, Harry Truman played the political game. Sometimes he played it dirty. But once he got in, I mean, there was a certain gravitas about him and his thinking. Dwight Eisenhower, and some statesmen who never became president that probably should have. Where are those people? You know, we got a bunch of yellers now, screamers, people who want ratings. I don't know. I don't know how this election is going to go. It could take twists and turns. We'll just have to see.
Is Bernie Sanders Jewish?
Yes.
How is he
That's not
getting
what,
the ratings?
I don't think that's going to hurt Bernie Sanders. What's going to hurt Bernie Sanders is they're going to hang the socialist label around his neck.
Yes,
And they will be relentless in that.
yes.
Which I don't think means a hill of beans to young people, because they don't put it in the context of the Cold War or anything like that. But to older generations, it does mean something. Something bad, yeah.
Do you think that when Trump first entered the race, that he was serious? No, I mean, that he actually was campaigning for the presidency
Well,
rather than trying to build his brand?
Did I think that when Donald Trump entered the race, that he was serious about being president? You know, read his memoirs, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. I don't know. I mean, if he wasn't, I mean, the thesis that you're alluding to is the possibility that this was a grand game for him to get, publicity, for his reality show and to feed his ego and all that kind of stuff, and that he would back out after he was satisfied. But that when he got in and found out that he had a constituency out there, he started to get serious about it. I don't know that. I really don't. I just don't know. I think he's serious about it now.
Yes.
I really am. And I think trying to predict the fortunes of Donald Trump is a big mistake. More than once I've told my wife, I think he's going to flame out, and I've been absolutely wrong. Yeah.
My husband and I met Donald Trump many years ago at Trump Plaza.
Yeah.
He spent a half hour, a gentleman, talking to us about Harry Helmsley, Leona Helmsley,
Yeah.
and real estate. And he was a perfect gentleman.
He
I
is.
just don't know what
He's a
happened.
nice guy.
I think he's a nice guy when he's not on the stage running for president.
I've just mentioned that, but...
I think his, you can talk about his 3 marriages and all that business, but the fact of the matter is, his 3 kids have turned out great.
Oh,
Yes.
yes, his daughter.
Ivana Trump is just super.
He's got 5 kids.
They're all, yeah.
What in
5 kids.
Yeah, but they're all basically pretty
Yes.
sound. They got their
Yes.
heads screwed on right. And you're right, in quiet moments, the guy seems reasonable.
Very well.
I've often been asked the question, I'm going to reveal something. I'm a Democrat, so I can say this about the Republicans. I've been asked sometimes, if you were in a room and you were down to the last days and you had to choose between Trump and Cruz, who would you pick?
Trump. I'll take Trump.
Now, I would take
I'm
Trump
voting
too.
for
I would take Trump too. And the reason,
I'm voting for
even
Trump.
though he has said some pretty bigoted, vicious things, which are, I think, is very disturbing, he has to have a certain pragmatic streak to him to carry on the kind of business that he has carried on, and continuing his father and growing his father's empire.
Right.
There's a pragmatic streak in him in the fact that that he contributed to prominent Democratic campaigns. That was pragmatism on his part. Not necessarily because he loved their ideology, but he knew it was important to play both sides, to hedge his bets.
Right.
There's a certain pragmatism. What bothers me about Ted Cruz, who is a very bright guy, I mean, there's no 2 bits about it. I think he's an ideologue.
Yes.
He's an ideologue.
Yes.
He's so doctrinaire that he's inflexible, and that in a leader really bothers me. Like that's an editorial sign around folks, and I'm not voting for either one of them, so I can
I
say
certainly make that statement.
anything else. Yeah.
The Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had to bring it up, but
Well, I mean, look, I agree with Sandra Day O'Connor, who's a Republican, that the president should appoint somebody. Now, whether that person gets through or not is a whole other issue. I think the odds say probably about 80% that it would not get through, that the stalling tactics would work and they wait until the new election. The wild card, of course, and I'm sure all of you have read this, are the vulnerable Republican senatorial candidates where obstructionism could hurt them in moderate states that they represent. And they could be hurt by playing along with the obstructionist game. I think the strategy by the White House is to go after those vulnerable Republicans in the Senate to try to get them to flip and to vote for the nominee. Now, it depends on who he nominates. If he nominates, a smart move, I think, I mean, and there's so many different ways. I think the Times today has an article on different strategies that he could use. And one of the smart strategies is to nominate an appellate judge who was unanimously approved by the Senate, which meant every Republican in the Senate voted for that judge, that appointment. That puts some Republicans in a difficult position. I don't know who it's going to be. I mean, it could be Valerie Jarrett. It could be, you know, an appellate judge nobody's ever heard of, but's got a good reputation. I think, yeah, I mean, I think if he goes for a real liberal judge whose record is liberal, he does so with the knowledge that it will not get through. And he knows that, but he may be playing on that. But that's a gamble on the election, isn't it? That a Democrat will be elected. And that's not a foregone conclusion, not at this point. So, you know, take your pick.
I do have something to say.
Well,
Just a minute, please. I do have something to say that, I don't know if it's a rumor or how true, that there was the report when Antonin Scalia was found in his room, there was a pillow over his
that was a
head.
conspiracy thing.
You know what, please don't interrupt.
The problem is that
And he did not have an autopsy.
conspiracy theories always arise, particularly when the family makes the decision not to have an autopsy.
Right.
And that's why there's a conspiracy. The problem is the guy's had years of heart disease and heart
Okay.
problems.
Then where did the...
Plus, I'm having a hard time figuring out motive for killing him.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it's not as if he's some gazillionaire that somehow money's going to be dispersed or a trophy wife is going to inherit or something like that. I mean, there's no particular motive for it. So I have to have a lot more evidence than that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
I can't believe it. You were wonderful again, and this time you have a tape, so 20 years from now, we'll all come and watch a rerun.
Oh, okay.